Quantitative methods can really reveal new and different things about human rights violations and about human rights fulfillment than only using qualitative data. So for example, it can show you what's going on at the level of the population. It can show you trends over time. And then you can disaggregate it to show you really interesting information about inequalities, about changes in different geographic locations, and also you can see whether there have been backsliding, which is going to be relevant to issues such as non-retrogression. So there are a lot of criteria that need to be thought about when you're selecting indicators and benchmarks. There's never going to be an absolute fit because, of course, you need context, you need qualitative data, you need interpretation to go along with the indicator, but you want to make sure that you are actually looking at what you want to be looking at. Another criteria that I think is important is the question of whether the individuals themselves whose rights are relevant would find this to be a revealing and a salient piece of data. And then also important is, would the duty bearer, the state, the agencies involved, find it salient and revealing? Another particular criteria that's important is disaggregation. You want data that you can disaggregate by categories that are relevant to human rights. So things like sex, gender, ethnicity, race, certainly income levels. Also, you want to be able to look for people with disabilities in your population. And to the extent that you can disaggregate the data, you'll be able to do kinds of analysis that aren't going to be available otherwise. So national human rights institutions are in a great position to access secondary data. Some of the things that they could immediately get are they could work with their national statistics offices to obtain administrative data, service data, so that would be things like water use, access to sanitation, things like access to education, enrollment rates. And then also they can access survey data. So that would be surveys, for example, the demographic and health surveys that are USAID funded surveys. The MIX, which is UNICEF funded survey that's also done in many countries. And then the World Bank has a series of household surveys as well. Those data are extremely helpful and actually have a lot of the attributes of the types of data you would want to use for human rights monitoring. Finally, census data has a lot to tell you about human rights and can be immediately accessed. So primary data might be important for a human rights institution to gather in spaces and issues where there is no secondary data available, or perhaps where there hasn't been a recent update of that secondary data. There might be a need to collect primary data. There are issues that are harder to collect data about if you're the state. So if you're a state institution, for example, certain kinds of corruption issues, perhaps, or issues around populations that are criminalized, it's very hard for the state to get data that's accurate about those populations or those issues because people may want to hide, for example, their behavior or their status. And so a national human rights institution has an independence that would allow it perhaps to set up a survey or another kind of data gathering instrument that would protect the rights holder while also allowing data to be gathered about them. Using data effectively can be very difficult, especially if we're talking about people who maybe don't have training in data analysis. Of course, some members of human rights institutions will have that training, and in those cases, I would, of course, just encourage people to work collaboratively with their colleagues. But if not, I think it's important to access expertise that you might not have. Working with a national statistical office, for example, or with academic institutions can be very helpful. And the reason that's important is it's very easy to make mistakes with data when we're not used to working with it. And that means we could accidentally mislead or accidentally come up with an analysis that's not exactly right. So it's important to access expertise when you feel like you need it. But I think that also requires having a sense of what kind of expertise you have within the institution and what kinds of gaps there might be.